IO9 presents The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. And here are your hosts, John Joseph Adams and David Barr Kirtley.
Hello, and welcome to episode 28 of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy.
Hi, I'm John Joseph Adams. I'm the editor of several anthologies, such as Wastelands and the Living Dead. My latest book is Brave New Worlds, an anthology of dystopian fiction. And other recent books include The Way of the Wizard and The Living Dead 2. And I'm also the editor of the magazines Fantasy and Lightspeed.
And I'm David Barr Kirtley. My short fiction appears in books such as New Voices in Science Fiction and Fantasy the Best of the Year. And my newest stories are Cats in Victory in Lightspeed, The Skull-Faced City in The Living Dead 2, and Family Tree in The Way of the Wizard. And today on the show, we'll be interviewing Jennifer Finney Boylan, author of the new middle-grade fantasy novel Falcon, Quinn, and the Black Mirror. Jenny is also the author of She's Not There, one of the first best-selling memoirs by a transgendered American. She's made numerous TV appearances, including The Oprah Winfrey Show, Larry King Live, and The Today Show. And she teaches English and creative writing at Colby College, where she was named Professor of the Year in 2000, and where I was lucky enough to study with her.
All right, so let's get to our interview.
All right, so we're here with Jennifer Finney Boylan. Welcome to the show.
Hi there, how are you?
So first of all, in your memoir, She's Not There, you talk about a childhood game called Girl Planet. Could you tell us about that?
Well, sure. As a transgender person, when I was a kid, I really didn't know what was wrong with me. You know, I had this sense of myself as not belonging. One of the things that I did when I was a child was I would go across the street to this big forest in Pennsylvania, where I grew up, and kind of walk through this forest, and I'd play this game where that I was an astronaut, crash landed on some foreign planet, and on this planet the air had this remarkable ability to change people, to change boys into girls. There was nothing you could do about it. It would even change your clothes. That's how powerful that atmosphere was. Anyway, that's one of the things I did when I was a kid, even before I knew, that transgender was a word, or that it even applied to me.
I mean, just sort of as a science fiction fan, it just sort of struck me that you would imagine sort of astronauts and alien planets and things. Do you have any idea why that?
Remember, of course, that in the mid '60s, space travel and space exploration was kind of a national obsession. So the Mercury program and the Gemini program and the Apollo program were things, they would bring in televisions into the classroom so we could watch the rocket launch, so we could watch the splashdowns. It was a big thing. There's a reason why Lost in Space and Star Trek, and later, much later on, Battlestar Galactica. All those things began not so much out of science fiction, I think, but also out of just the reality that space was something that we cared about back in the day, which I don't think it is now, unfortunately.
So in your first novel, The Planets, there's a character who secretly dresses up as a wizard. So how'd you come up with that?
Wow, you've really done your homework. I didn't know anybody had read The Planets anymore. There's a character who dresses up as a wizard. I don't know, man. When I wrote The Planets, I was about 30 years old, and I was not out. I was still kind of living as a boy, but I was definitely obsessed with people who had secrets, and how would people live with secrets? And certainly I had a secret life as a woman that I was trying to keep as well hidden as I possibly could. There's this one character, Wendy Willisco, who I think you're referring to, and she's got a very active fantasy life where she dresses up in medieval garb, and she's one of a group of people who lives in this kind of desperate, dying mill town where there's a fire. It's not a mill town; it's a coal town. There's a fire underground and the coal seams, and it's a very grim place. And in response to that, she's got this Baroque fantasy life. Now you can see that as a reflection of what it's like to be transgender, and surely I did have a Baroque fantasy life of my own, nearly as Baroque as secretly being a wizard. But I think in a larger sense, I wanted to talk about the way people have fantasy lives, and sometimes their fantasy lives are sources of tremendous power and play and fun. And I hate the way in the culture in which sometimes we'll talk about someone's not well grounded in reality because they have a very big fantasy life. Sometimes we see that as it's a way of criticizing someone or making it seem as if the character is just not well adjusted. Whereas, sometimes people who have fine fantasy lives are extremely well adjusted. That's how they stay well adjusted. I don't know. I guess for a lot of transgender people, though, the question gets raised, what is your fantasy life? Is your fantasy life what you're doing when no one else is around and you're able to be the person you imagine yourself to be? Or is your fantasy life reality? The you everyone thinks is real is in fact something that you've had to invent. For me, as a trans woman, the idea of this guy that I had to be back before I came out, I feel like that was a fantasy life. And so for this particular character in the planets, this woman who, is dressing up as a wizard and as a cave woman and God knows what else she's got going on there. There is a sense that fantasy doesn't make her all that happy in the end, that she can't reconcile reality, which is a very disappointing place, with her private and imaginative self, which is a wonderfully exciting place, but frustrating because it's not real.
As someone who was keeping this secret, did you ever write fiction where you were afraid that you would be giving too much away to people who would read it?
I think readers of my early work detected some sort of inner struggle. I don't know. When I look at those books now, which I very rarely do, I think my sense of the person telling the stories is that the person telling the story is keeping something from the reader. The author of those stories is trying to get by on sheer speed and cleverness alone. The novels are very much about how cool and crazy they are, which is not a bad thing for a novel to be about, I have to say. But there's not a lot of emotional truth. Although, I want to make sure those novels are really funny, and they're propelled by a kind of manic energy. And I think we have a tendency to kind of look down on comedy as a form less exalted than, say, a story about, emotional truth where everyone is sitting around talking about how miserable they are. And although obviously there's nothing more important for me at this point in my life than trying to encourage everyone to live their lives openly and honestly, I also want to say there's a lot to be said for comic buoyancy, the sheer joy and exuberance of wicked laughter. There's no shortage of books and creations in this world in which people are crying their eyes out because they're trying to live their truth and can't. But there is a shortage of books that are really genuinely funny and make you just put the book down in shock and amazement and think, wow, that was some weird shit. So, if you're funny, you can get away with a lot. I've certainly found that look at, I've had a fairly successful career talking about transgender issues to people, and people are put at ease by the fact that I have a sense of humor and I can make this difficult material seem funny. I had this amazing experience this week, or actually it was just last week. I went back to my old high school. I'd been asked by the headmaster of my old high school, which was an all-boys school, to come and talk. And I had very mixed feelings about doing it because it sounded to me kind of like the nightmare you'd wake up from screaming. That you're back at your old high school after your sex change, and also you're incredibly old. Did I mention that you're incredibly old? And yet, when I left the auditorium, it went really, really well. I was really surprised. The boys at that school cheered like I was Elvis. It was really deeply moving. And I heard one kid on the way out say to the other, wow, that was really, I didn't expect that was going to be so funny.
Could you talk about Richard Russo's character, Professor Phineas?
Well, I can. It's all supposed to be a great big mistake, Professor Phineas in Russo's novel Straight Man is called Finney, which is the middle name that I took. It's actually my partner's maiden name. So for a long time I was using Finney as my middle name, my nom de plume, because there was another James Boylan back in the day. And so I used James Finney Boylan to differentiate myself from him, and also because it was an act of love. So anyway, there I was at some party, and somebody came up to me and said, "Did you read Russo's new novel?" And I said, "No." And they said, "Well, gee, what do you think about him naming that crossdresser after you?" And of course, this was back before I came out, back when I thought this was all, a state secret. And I just thought, what? Oh my God, he knows. Everybody knows. So I was kind of hurt by it. And only later did Rick say to me, "Oh, that is your name." Oh well, but it was because no one, including Rick, thought that I was a crossdresser. Actually, it was all supposed to be big fun, and we all had a good laugh about it. But it was one of those moments, and it's heartbreaking when you find yourself in a moment like this where you have to laugh along with everyone else, because to not laugh means that you have to pretend that you don't have something secret that's tearing you apart. You have to keep up the front of being like everyone else. I think that's actually a very common experience that people have.
I saw on your website that Will Forte played you in a skit on Saturday Night Live. What was the context of that?
My greatest moment as a professor ever, the shining pinnacle of my career, was turning on Saturday Night Live when I never watched that show anymore because I don't know, why don't I watch that show? Because I'm old and because I'm sleepy. But I was watching it one Saturday night, kind of at random, and there was Will Forte imitating me. And the cool thing was that it was actually very respectful. The skit was that it was a takeoff of the Larry King show that I'd been on the following week. And on the Larry King show, Larry just got completely lost. There were a couple of transgender people on the show, and he couldn't remember what sex anyone was or what sex they'd been or which direction anybody was going. He asked me a question. So Jennifer, back when you were a man, were you a lesbian? And I was like, what are you talking? I mean, actually, in a way, the answer is yes, but that's not how he meant. I was not there were other people on the show with whom he was just completely confused. Anyway, so in this bit, the joke was on Larry King. There was another actor who was playing Larry King, getting completely lost, and the Will Forte character played the role of this relatively nice person who just couldn't believe that Larry was getting so lost. So, speaking of straight man, they played me. A man played me as a woman as a straight man to Larry King. But in a way, I thought, well, gee, that's kind of a measure of how much the culture's changed too. That you could have someone playing me on Saturday Night Live, and that I would not be the object of the joke. Some people did ask me, so weren't your feelings hurt that they had a man playing you? But of course, my immediate and clever answer was, "Hey man, a man played me for years. It's fine."
Okay, so you talked about having a powerful emotional reaction to the Fellowship of the Ring movie. Could you tell us about that?
Well, sure. I was a Tolkien nerd in the '70s, and when I found out they were doing that movie, the Peter Jackson movie, I was totally psyched for it, and I was amazed what a good job they were able to do. I don't know that the screenplay for those Lord of the Rings movies have really gotten the praise they deserve. One of the reasons those movies were never made, in addition to just the CGI stuff not being advanced enough until the turn of the millennium, it's also just that there's just a lot going on in those films, and it's very hard to write. And I just thought they did a magnificent job of incorporating most of what is really cool about the book. Now, I think anybody who's involved in fantasy literature enjoys it not only for just the sheer imaginative romp of it, but also looks at these things in very personal terms. And so for me, I always had a very intimate relationship with Lord of the Rings. I hope it doesn't sound too deranged to say that when you spend your life struggling with a frame of mind that you don't particularly want to go over to. When I was a man, I really wanted not to be transgender. It bummed me out. It was this endless yearning that just could not be satisfied by anything, and it was kind of absurd to me. I was like, why do I need to be female so drastically? It's the dumbest thing. Why would I need that? and why does everything else in my life keep pulling me towards that? And so the ring in the Lord of the Rings movies felt like to an adolescent, like a really powerful symbol for something that is irresistible and pulling you toward it, and you can't resist it. And so the ring, to a certain extent, I saw as, when I was a kid, was kind of like embracing this dark truth of being trans. So when Bilbo and Frodo meet up again in Rivendell, and Bilbo turns into a monster and tries to grab that ring for a second, there's it's a really kind of powerful, scary moment. And then he just says, I'm so sorry. I'm sorry that you have to carry this burden. I'm sorry about everything. And of course, by that time I wasn't transitioned, and I was with my spouse and watching the movie, and I felt really bad for her that this person that she married, meaning me, turned out to be someone other than the man she thought she was married to. So that idea of, I'm sorry you've come in for this burden. I'm sorry about everything. Was certainly something that hit me very strongly.
You recently contributed a piece to the forthcoming anthology, It Gets Better. Could you tell us a little bit about that project?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think a lot of people know about the It Gets Better project by this point. Dan Savage is the guy who initiated this, and it was in response to the teen suicides on college campuses and high schools in the fall of 2010. There is, in some ways, a very simple message. You want to tell young people that their lives are not always going to be as difficult as they are when they're 16. That eventually you get away from this world and you get to make your own world to a certain extent. And so anyway, the It Gets Better project was just a series of pieces, especially on YouTube, in which older people just wanted to send a message that life, you won't always hurt the way you hurt when you're an adolescent, to young GLBT people who particularly might be struggling and considering taking their own lives. So I think the final book is 100 of these pieces. I don't know if they're all celebrities or if some of them are just somewhat obscure or what, but I know I was the second one accepted, and the first one was Gregory Maguire, who did the Wicked books and some of those books. And the piece, and they're meant to be short. My piece is actually something that originally appeared in a slightly different form in She's Not There, a story of a trip to Nova Scotia when I wasn't quite sure what I was going to do. But I was thinking of, I don't know if I was really thinking of ending it all, but I was certainly very depressed and I didn't know what to do, and I climbed a mountain and stood at the edge of a cliff. And I did not die. I failed to die. And so, and that's the heart of what that piece is about. I think that book is coming out from Penguin in February or March. It's a real rush. It's coming out in a great big hurry.
So we've talked a bit about your memoir, She's Not There, but you also wrote a memoir about growing up in a haunted house. Yeah, well, the second memoir is called I'm Looking Through You, and it is about, on the surface, it's about growing up in a house that was allegedly haunted. Yet, I think the real ghosts in that book are psychological. What haunting seems to mean to me is the way in which people are trying to negotiate between the people that they are, the people that they've been, and the people that they will become in time. When you're an older person, as I am, you're often, to be haunted can mean that something happened in your past that you've never quite gotten over, or that you're just not at peace with. When you're a young person, if you're haunted, it's that you can't quite imagine who you're going to be when you grow up, or you can't imagine growing up at all. This isn't a thing that's unique to transgender people. I think lots of people struggle with how to draw a line between who they've been and who they've become.
But it's a unique situation for transgender people because as a grown woman now, I'm a woman who never had a girlhood, particularly. I had a boyhood, and it was a boyhood that wasn't necessarily all unhappy either. And there are some things that I did that are kind of stereotypically boy things in my past. So what does that mean? So that's what, to a certain extent, I'm Looking Through You is about. It's trying to figure out how to be happy as a woman when I'm haunted by this boy that I was, and also by the girl that I never was. And I hope it does provide a good coda to She's Not There, because, I mean, a lot of transgender, I mean, by the way, there's like 8 million transgender memoirs out there, and often if the protagonist is transsexual, the climax of the book is a trip to some surgeon's office, and afterwards, everyone lives happily ever after. And I wanted to kind of deconstruct that narrative, if you'll pardon the phrase, and show that, you know, the ghosts that you wrestle with, you never completely get rid of. It's not a unqualified happy ending. It's a qualified happy ending, as Rousseau would call it. And yet, in that way of trying to make peace with the people we've been, the experience of a transgender person is not substantively different from the experience that anybody else has as you get older and you try to think, who is that child that I was? Where is that child now? The answer is that you know, as E.T. would say, you know, I'll be right here. The child is within you, and you carry him or her with you.
So your latest novel is Falcon Quinn and the Black Mirror. What's it about?
Falcon Quinn and the Black Mirror is a young adult project that I wrote with my then middle school age boys. And it is about a young man who, when he turns 13, finds that the school bus takes him to an academy for monsters. And before everybody starts to groan and say, oh, how Harry Potter of you, I have to say that the book really doesn't have anything to do with Harry Potter, except for the fact that, you know, there's a school and there's a kid. For the characters in Harry Potter, you know, they're kind of psyched that they're all going to be wizards and witches and that there's magic. I mean, that's all a lot of fun. I mean, the whole Voldemort and end of the world thing, that's not so much a good time. But mostly being a kid who is able to use magic is seen as a good thing. Well, at the Academy for Monsters, Falcon and his friends are, in general, not thrilled about being monsters. They're kind of bummed out about it, and each of them has to be diagnosed with what kind of monsterhood they're suffering from. And the purpose of the Academy is to teach you how not to be a monster, how to imitate a human being so that you can survive in the world. So what Falcon Quinn is about a bunch of kids who are being taught how to resist their natures, which means that the fundamental question of Falcon Quinn is this: is it better to learn how to become something you're not, if it literally means you can survive in the world, or to embrace your true self if your true self is like a zombie or a Sasquatch? And for Falcon, our hero, it's even more complex because it's not even clear that Falcon is a monster. We don't know what he is, and there's a possibility that he's been brought to the Academy by mistake, and he has to ask himself if he will lose all of his friends if it turns out that he's not a monster and he has to come out as a human being. So Falcon Quinn is about all the same stuff I've been writing about before. I hope, and you don't have to be an English major to realize that these are all issues of identity and difference that are at the heart of certainly the memoirs I've been writing about. But what I hope the cool thing about Falcon Quinn is that, you know, middle schoolers and the Harry Potter demographic can read this book and see it just as a fun, goofy book about monsters. And at the same time, it works perfectly well as a metaphor for what do we do with people who are different in the culture, particularly in middle school when issues of difference are, begin to really be burdens in kids' hearts. Anyway, I wrote the book with and for my boys who had such a ball. Max the Sasquatch is essentially built upon the character of my older boy, who is a large, happy-go-lucky kind of a hippie guy. And Falcon is a little bit more like my younger son, Sean, who's very smart and very cunning and witty, and he's a logician. He's always trying to figure out how things fit together. So I have to say, it was a delightful thing to do. It was the most fun I've had as a writer in my life, because the boys would get home from school at the end of the day. They'd throw their backpacks on the floor, and they'd say, "So, did you do any work on the monster book today?" And I would tell them what I'd written. I'd read them what I'd written that day, and they were the toughest audience in the world. In fact, I had to change the ending to the second book because they just would not accept the ending that I'd written. So every writer should have two people as critics that they love as much as I love my boys. It's good for you as a writer and as a parent.
See, I heard you say that one of your sons suggested a were-turtle character, but that didn't pass scientific muster with your other son. What's wrong with a were-turtle?
The were-turtle did in fact come out, but there was a lot of disagreement about how is it that some of these kids transform into their animal selves at a time other than the full moon. So we had a major argument about that, about whether were creatures could become their own selves when the moon was not full. But fictionally, you end up finessing it in the same way that in Twilight they had to figure out a way of enabling the vampires to walk around during the daytime. So I will say that there are vampires in Falcon Quinn, but the vampires in Falcon Quinn are kind of the snobs. There's a certain monster pyramid with some monsters are better than other monsters. So the vampires think of themselves as like the bomb. And then beneath them is anything with like leprechauns and anything else that has magical powers. And then below them are, is anything that's been dead, that's been brought back to life. And the very bottom are zombies who are just, decaying. So I liked writing that because kids know in 8th grade what the equivalent is. Where you fit in, whether you're on the football team or whether you're in band, or whether you're in chorus, or whether you're one of the quiet people who just, plays on his DS, or whether you're, an Xbox nerd or what. Everybody kind of knows where they fit in the pecking order. And so that was really fun to write about. And it gave me a chance to kind of push back against the culture's current obsession with vampires. Although I think I have to say, it seems to me like the vampire thing is over. I think everybody's sick of vampires. So it's now on to zombies. I think we're going to get pretty sick of zombies pretty soon, too, if you ask me.
Well, speaking of monsters, one of my favorite events at Colby was the Halloween readings that you did with Professor Bassett. Could you talk about how that got started and what sorts of things you read over the years?
It's something that Professor Bassett had been doing long before I ever arrived. I came to Colby when I was 30 years old in 1988, and Bassett immediately saw in me a kindred spirit, which is to say, a ham. So on Halloween, Bassett and I would go to the chapel and we would read ghost stories for the students. And if that just sounds too little college warm and cozy for you, what can I say other than that it was a ball. It was fun. And, the ghost stories, some of them were really scary, but most of them were kind of silly. Bassett would read The Swordsman of Varnus, which I believe ends with one character saying, "Oh, the hell with it," and shooting everyone with a laser gun. And he would read. One time he read a Woody Allen story about I forget. There's somehow a character, some English major winds up stuck inside Madame Bovary. I read a couple Stephen King stories. There's a Nicholson Baker story about a man who's attacked by evil potatoes. I've read pieces from The Princess Bride, which is always fun because everyone in the audience always can recite the dialogue of The Princess Bride in unison. I often read The Cremation of Sam McGee, which is a poem that a lot of people learn in 8th grade. So, I don't know, it's just a chance to community is hard enough to form. And reading ghost stories for my students, along with Charlie, was a great way of bringing people together. Charlie, who of course died this fall after teaching at Colby for something like, 50 years. And I'm going to try to keep the tradition going next year, but it's going to have to change a little bit without him. But what I loved about that was the way in which it celebrated telling stories. It was a way of bringing people together to share a story, to share that experience of being a little bit scared and a little bit joyful. it's one of the things that stories can do is bring people together, and I hope I can keep that tradition going.
So on the Colby campus, there's this strange monument that encourages students to invent anti-gravity devices. Do you know what the story is with that?
That's the Babson anti-gravity stone, and in fact, it's funny. It's one of the genuinely eccentric things on that campus. Apparently, there's this guy whose name was Babson, and he had $1 gazillion, and he was going to give the $1 gazillion to the school, but only on the condition that the school put up a monument saying, we need to discover how to harness the forces of anti-gravity, because that way we can reduce airplane accidents. So there is, in fact, on the Colby campus, the Babson anti-gravity stone says, this stone is placed by the Babson Anti-Gravity Foundation, reminding us all of the blessings forthcoming when a way to utilize the powers of anti-gravity is at last found. So he gave like 1/10 of his fortune to Colby. I think I might have the story wrong, but he gave the rest of it to a college that's now called Babson. There's a Babson College in Massachusetts, which is a business college, and they got most of the money. We got the stone, but the stone is still there, and they keep moving it around because they keep putting up buildings wherever they keep moving it to a more and more obscure place, and then a building goes up there. So I don't know where it is now. Maybe it's floating.
Hey, little known fact, the UK title of J.K. Rowling's first novel is Harry Potter and the Babson Anti-Gravity Stone. I don't know if you guys knew that.
Right. Right. The anti-gravity stone. Well, we should all be so lucky to discover an anti-gravity stone.
Okay, great. I mean, you mentioned the Falcon Quinn sequel you're working on. I mean, do you want to mention anything about what you're working on or what's coming out? Or
So let's see. Falcon Quinn is out right now in hardcover, and it will be Falcon Quinn and the Black Mirror. The first book comes out in paperback in May of 2011. Same week, the second book, Falcon Quinn and the Crimson Vapor, comes out in hardcover. So that's 2011, paper for the first book and hardcover for the second. And then in 2012, I have a new novel for grown-ups, which is my first adult novel in many years, and that's coming out from Broadway, which is an imprint of Random House. And the title of that book is "I'll Give You Something to Cry About." And the year after that, 2013, will be the 10th anniversary of She's Not There, and tentatively we're looking forward to a 10th anniversary edition of that book with a new. I think there'll be an afterword by Anna Quindlen, in which she interviews my spouse, Deirdre, and also I get a chance to write just kind of an update of what's happened to everybody and all the characters. So that's the near future. That plus the It Gets Better anthology, which is coming out in the early part of 2011. And that's it on the Jenny Boylan front. And I want to encourage any of your listeners who want to know more to please stop by jenniferboylan.net. You can learn about everything happening in the Jenny Boylan universe.
And that was our interview. So thanks so much to Jennifer Finney Boylan for joining us on the show. Okay, so at the end of our last episode, we asked if people could go on iTunes and rate our podcast, and at that time, 8 people had rated the show, and now we're up to 23. So thanks to everyone who went ahead and did that. And if you haven't rated the show, please consider opening up iTunes and typing in Geek's Guide to the Galaxy and doing that.
Yeah, we also want to thank Brilliance Audio for sponsoring the show for the past 3 months. They came along at a really crucial time last year, and their support was really important in convincing us to keep doing the show. We've now run through all the ads they contracted for, and so we'll need to start looking into maybe finding some new sponsors. But for the moment, you can enjoy this ad-free episode of Geek's Guide. And as always, if you want to help us out, you can go to our website at geeksguideshow.com and click on the donate button and send us some money. Okay, so now we're going to be talking about monsters, with sort of a special emphasis on sympathetic portrayals of monsters. And so, Jenny mentioned Wicked by Gregory Maguire. And that's sort of, the Wizard of Oz, told from the point of view of the Wicked Witch of the West. And it's funny, I listened to an interview with Gregory Maguire, and they asked him, how did you get the idea for that book? And he said that he just got really interested in sort of the question of evil and what makes a person evil, and thought about sort of writing a story from the point of view of Hitler.
And that was the initial idea. And he was just kind of like, actually, that would probably require a lot of research. Maybe I'll just make it the Wicked Witch of the West instead. And I don't know. I've always just thought that was kind of funny. That and that's where that story idea came from.
Right. Yeah, I mean, for Wicked, I wouldn't have actually thought of that as a sympathetic portrayal of monsters. I mean, because I don't think of her as a monster. I mean, she's a villain certainly, and I mean, I guess she is sort of monstrous. But I mean, like when I think monster, I think like monster, like a minotaur or a dragon or something. Like those are monsters, right?
You don't think a witch is a monster?
Not really. That's just a
with
witch,
green skin who gets melted by water and stuff.
Well, no, she's just
flies around on a broom and has flying monkey, scary monkey monsters.
I mean, she's just a person. She's just an evil person who can do magic things.
All right. Well, I'm still going to talk about it because
okay, fine.
Because I thought about it. I already thought about this, but there was a this bookstore event I went to years ago that was really, really good. It was one of the best bookstore events I went to. It was at Barnes & Noble at Union Square. And they actually had Gregory Maguire there with some of the cast members from the Broadway production of Wicked. And so how it worked is he would get up and read, like a I don't know, 15 or 20 minute section, a scene from the novel. And then they would perform the song that had been adapted from that scene in the novel. And it was just really cool. And so you sort of go back and forth with him reading and them singing. And, it was free. It was, 45 minutes long or so. And I kind of enjoyed that more than an actual Broadway show, because most of the Broadway shows I go to, like I watch the first half and I'm like, wow, that was great. And then they're like, oh no, but there's still a whole nother half, and I'm kind of I'm usually about ready, I'm ready to go do something else by the time intermission rolls around. But, so that bookstore event, 45 minutes, you're in and out. It was a good time. And I wish they would do more stuff like that. I guess it's not every fantasy novel gets a Broadway production associated with it, but
unfortunately,
I guess I guess we interviewed Kat Valenti and Eric Garcia. I think both mentioned that they sort of incorporate music into their readings and sort of liven it up a little bit.
Yeah, actually, we went to I don't know if you were there for this one, but the KGB Reading Series in New York at the KGB bar. At the KGB bar, they do this thing called Fantastic Fiction, which is, science fiction and fantasy readers reading their stories. And so this author, Brian Francis Slattery, he wrote the book Spaceman Blues, and then later he wrote one called Liberation. He did a reading there, and I guess he's some sort of he's a musician of some kind. I'm not sure what you call his genre, but he was there for the reading, and he also incorporated some music into it, and I thought it worked really well. I mean, I kind of wish that I had a lyric sheet so I could have followed along better with what he was singing. But I mean, it was really, really cool. I mean, because it was related to the book that he was reading from, and it just had a very cool vibe about it. So yeah, I mean, I could definitely see that being something that would be fun if we could see it more often.
And then Jenny was also talking about Lord of the Rings, and speaking of like sort of looking at things, sort of taking a sympathetic view of the monsters, that sort of made me think of this Andy Duncan story called Senator Bilbo.
Mm-hmm.
I guess I read an interview with him, and he was saying that, he just came across this odd historical fact that there was this actual, historical figure named Senator Bilbo, who was a sort of like arch segregationist. And so Andy Duncan was like, okay, come on, I can't be the first fantasy writer who's noticed that there was the Senator Bilbo guy. And so he sort of poked around and couldn't find anybody else who would use that. And he's just like, jackpot, you know? And so in this story, it's like after the War of the Ring and everything, and, the orcs are being integrated into Hobbit society, and Bilbo is just sort of this angry old politician. He just can't get over the fact that the orcs are living among them. And, I don't know, it's just a really interesting, memorable story. And it was actually, performed on the Podcastle podcast. It's episode 32. So if you're interested in checking out that story, you can go look it up online, and we'll have a link in the show notes.
Yeah, actually, how did he get around the copyright issues over that? Because, I mean, Lord of the Rings is not public domain. And, I mean, that doesn't sound like it was parody, per se. I mean, it's, does he get away with it because it falls under parody? Or
it sort of sounds like parody to me.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, it's, I haven't read it, so I don't know. But, I mean, yeah, I guess that makes sense. I mean, just because it doesn't sound like it's inherently just, like, funny or whatever. It's just like,
But it's sort of, like critiquing the way that the orcs are portrayed, and
Yeah,
stuff. I don't know. I think, when you're talking about, fair use and copyright and stuff, the parody stuff, it's pretty broad. I mean, and I think anything that you can even sort of plausibly argue is parody is covered.
Yeah, but anyway, speaking of Lord of the Rings, I mean that I agree that was sort of an interesting thing to discover, that like when someone pointed out to me like that Lord of the Rings can be a little bit like, or it can be kind of racist towards the orcs, and it's like because they're just portrayed in this totally negative light, and like you don't really get to see them as a potential sentient race. It's just like they're these evil monsters, and it's like, oh, huh, yeah, that's true, and I mean I grew up with orcs in D&D, more so than with Lord of the Rings, so I mean it's like, and I mean, and it's funny because in D&D, like you can play a half orc, but you can't play an orc. But I always was sort of drawn to playing, to wanting to play monsters in D&D, so it's like, I mean, the subject of this episode is actually of particular interest to me, but, I mean, we can talk about that a little bit more later, like why we're drawn to these sort of portrayals of monsters, but,
actually the very first computer role-playing game that I really played a lot was this game called Fantasy. It was, Phantasie.
I'm right with you there, brother. I love that game.
And you remember how, in that, you can pick to be a human, elf, dwarf, like the usual stuff. But then there's also this option for random. And it just like throws out these like, weird monsters like minotaurs and trolls and ogres and stuff. And so you can have them as members of your party. And
yeah, I always loved that. Like I would not start a new game in Fantasy unless I had a minotaur in my party. Although I think actually, didn't you need to have a minotaur to complete one of the quests or something? I think you did.
Yeah, I think there's like a dungeon where you can only get into it if you have a minotaur in your party or something like that. But I mean, one of the things, and so like a lot of the random monsters, could be a lot stronger. Like an ogre or something could be a lot stronger than a human could. So it was good to have them as fighters in your party. But then, there were drawbacks to having them too, and one of them was that there was like so much like discrimination against them that, when it came time to, whenever in that game, whenever you went up a level, you would have to pay somebody to train you to get up to the next level. And so you'd be like, you'd go to the training hall and say, I'd like you to train my human. And they're like, that'll be like 25 gold. And then you're like, okay, now I'd like you to train my ogre. And they're like, that'll be 12,000 gold. There was also this, I haven't read this book, but there's this book called Throne of Bones by Brian McNaughton. And I came across it like on Amazon one time, and I just noticed this quote by Alan Rogers, and he says, "Imagine what Tolkien's Lord of the Rings would have been like if Tolkien had tried to tell that story sympathetically from the point of view of the human denizens of Mordor, and you'll have the slightest sense of what you're about to wade into." And I've always been very intrigued by that description. So if anyone's read that book, actually, post a comment and let us know, what you thought of it.
That just reminds me that, this author, Stan Nichols, he wrote this book called Orcs. And I remember, and I guess it was published in the UK a while ago, but then it was just re-released here in the US, like a year or two ago. And I remember when it first came out and the publicity copies were going out, the publicist he had like a little business card inside the book, and he just wrote like Orcs in all capital letters with an exclamation point on it. And I was like, yes, this is exactly this is exactly the right tone to strike. But and I haven't read the book. It's actually an omnibus, I think, of like 3 different short novels. But so I got the book. I mean, the galley just looked like a regular galley, but when the finished book came out, it had like red onion skin, or it had onion skin pages, and the edges were all red. So, and then like if you held it open in your hand, like it was like very soft, so it just like flopped open. It's like, this is like the Orc Bible. It's like it was awesome, and I actually I contacted the author, and I was like, because I was writing for sci-fi.com at the time, and I was like, would you be interested in doing like sort of a joke interview with this, like as if I interviewed you and as if this was actually the Orc Bible? And he was kind of into it, but then he got busy or something, so we never did it. But I just like when I thought of that, I was like, well, what would Orc Jesus do? That's what I want to know.
I mean, some other sort of computer games that kind of came to mind is there was this game called Dungeon Keeper. I don't know if you remember this one.
I don't remember that one.
It was kind of like Sim Dungeon, sort of, where, in most games, you have a party of heroes and you go into dungeons and kill monsters and get treasure and stuff. And in Dungeon Keeper, you're sort of like the guy in charge of the dungeon. You're sort of expanding your dungeon and summoning more and more monsters and stuff. And these heroes keep busting into your dungeon and stealing your treasure and stuff. And you have to, defend it. And it's kind of this cool dungeon ecology simulator almost, where the different monsters like don't get along with each other, and you have to keep like the vampires away from these guys because they'll eat them, and I don't know, it's just a really really interesting idea. I actually just saw that they're remaking this. They're making a Dungeon Keeper Online, but it's a Chinese company. It looks like they're only releasing it in China. I don't know if anyone in China listens to this podcast, but if you're out there, keep an eye out for that.
Hey, that kind of reminded me. I mean, it's not really about a sympathetic portrayal of monsters, but do you remember this game called Mail Order Monsters?
Yeah.
Oh my God, that game was so awesome. It was like, it's like you would build your own monsters, and it's like, I mean, you could have like a number of different templates, like, in a humanoid was one, but then like you could also have like this dinosaur thing as a template, and there was all these different monster type templates, but then like you would buy all these like augmentations for the monster, and like, so you can basically take that template and then turn it into almost any kind of monster, by adding different powers to it.
Well, like, back when I was, when I was a kid, I was really into role-playing games. I sort of came up with a thing like that. I was trying to make this sort of thing where you would roll dice to create monsters, where, you would roll, like, how many heads does it have, and, what kind of, like the head of this kind of animal or whatever, and, see what kind of, like, weird monsters, would just come out of, rolling the dice and combining different bits and pieces and stuff. Mm-hmm. And actually, I mean, sort of what got me onto that was that I had come across this quote. I think it was a poet. I can't remember who it was, but he had said something like he was sort of bemoaning the limitations of the human imagination, and he was kind of saying, like, if you've seen an eagle, then somebody says, there's a purple eagle. Even if you've never seen a purple eagle, you can imagine what a purple eagle would look like. But that if you'd never seen an eagle, you couldn't just summon that image out of your imagination. That the imagination can only sort of transform things or combine things that it's already familiar with. Mm-hmm. And so I spent a lot of time thinking about that, and, is that really true? And I sort of decided it really is true to a substantial extent. I sort of went through, because I used to be just really like obsessive about collecting those like Dungeons and Dragons monster manuals. Mm-hmm. I had like every single one, and I sort of went through it, and I was like looking for monsters that, weren't just, because most of the monsters, it's like a giant this, or it's a this with the head of a this, or, it's a this with two heads or whatever. And, it's like, how many monsters are there in here that somebody just dreamed up out of their imagination? And there's really very few, I mean, that really is, a real limit of just the way that the mind works.
Well, I guess it's also kind of partially because, like, if you're creating this monster for the purpose of being in a story or something, like even in like, old times, not like modern novels or whatever, but, like in ancient Greece or whatever, you say you're telling a story for, incorporating the gods and everything into something like the Odyssey or whatever, it's like, how are you going to explain to people what this monster looks like if you're not going to be comparing it to things that really exist, Yeah. I mean, that's part of the problem. It's like, if maybe in the modern day it would be easier because, you could use digital effects or whatever to make something really come to life fully, or I mean, I guess even back then, I mean, they could have tried to draw, something that would depict it, but.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a real issue, is how do you describe something, if you're a novelist or whatever, how would you describe in words something that's, doesn't have any earthly analogs, but certainly, visual artists, as you're saying, could do it. And like there's a monster in Dungeons and Dragons called an owl bear. It's kind of a weird thing where it's just like a bear with the head of an owl. Yeah. And, and so like somebody, like say there was no such thing as bears and no such thing as owls, could anybody like draw something, could anybody come up with an owl bear and just draw like an owl's head? I mean, it's very hard, but I mean, certainly it could be done. I mean,
Yeah.
Okay. So, I mean, on an earlier, I guess it was back in the Naomi Novik, episode, I had given John this little pop quiz on, what color dragons, breathe different substances. And that was a lot of fun. So I thought I would spring on him another pop quiz. Involving, some Dungeons and Dragons monsters.
Oh, well, I haven't looked at a monster manual in quite some time. I hope I'm up to it.
Yeah. So, I guess we'll start off with an easy one. So this is a monster with the body of a man and the head of a bull.
Well, that's a minotaur.
Very good. Yeah, I figured
Minotaur is one of my favorite monsters. So.
I figured you'd get that because you already mentioned minotaurs, but
yeah.
That's sort of a warm-up question. All right. Okay, so these tall, green humanoid monsters can regenerate their limbs unless you kill it with fire.
That's a troll.
All right, very good, very good. All right, this one's a little trickier. So these six-legged black pumas have 2 tentacles on their backs and always seem to be 2 feet away from where they actually are.
Displacer beast.
Oh, very, very good, very good. All right. How about a giant metal bull that breathes poison gas?
A giant metal what?
Bull.
Bull? Bull.
Bull, like a minotaur-headed bull.
I see, a bull. A giant metal bull. I don't know what that one is.
Yeah, it's a tough one. They're called a gorgon.
Oh, okay.
In Dungeons and Dragons. And it's kind of funny because in Greek mythology, Medusa was a gorgon. Mm-hmm. And she was not a giant metal bull that breathes poison gas.
Right. No, I do vaguely remember those now from the the monster manual, but I didn't remember that they were metal. Why are they metal? That's weird.
I don't know. I guess it's harder to kill a giant bull if it's metal.
I guess.
Makes sense.
It's a convenient storage, for all the poison gas inside. I don't know. It's like they don't need any bone structure because they're made of metal.
But it always just drove me crazy. It's like, no, that's not what a gorgon is.
Yeah, right.
And I have a feeling it's one of those things where, somebody was just like, okay, I've got this cool idea for a monster. It's like a metal bull. What's a good monster name? Gorgon. And it's kind of like you sort of like, you think a lot of times, like, especially if you're a writer, it's a real danger where you like come up with something and you think that you just made it up, but actually it's something you heard somewhere, Mm-hmm. I have a feeling that that's what happened there. It's kind of funny too, actually, in the Ultima series, the evil bad guy that you have to kill in Ultima 3 is named Exodus, like the book of the Bible. And they said like, yeah, we just thought it was a cool sounding word. We didn't realize, that it was from the Bible. All right, so our next monster, these are sort of large levitating orbs with a giant eye, one giant eye, and
Beholder.
Wait, let me finish. And then tentacles with little eyes on them. But yeah, very good, Beholder.
I have a Beholder miniature that I painted, and as we record this, I'm finished. I'm in the middle of moving from New Jersey to California. I'm here in California, but my stuff is on the way to California. I just had to pack all my miniatures up, and but yeah, one of them is a Beholder. Although one of my miniatures actually escaped. I wonder if you're going to ask about this monster, but one of my miniatures had fallen behind my bookcase, and so I had to pack it separately, and I just took it in my suitcase. So, ask me about that after the pop quiz is done, in case you don't ask about it.
Okay. Yeah, we just have a couple more monsters here.
Okay.
But actually, as I was saying, like the Beholder was one of the monsters, in the monster manual where, it's sort of less of an analog to anything in the real world, that this is more something that sprang just out of somebody's imagination. I mean, it's kind of bits and pieces of other things, but it is kind of a more sort of inventive kind of monster. Mm-hmm. Unlike our next one. Okay, so a chimera combines bits and pieces of these 3 animals.
Oh. Let's see, it's a lion, right?
Mm-hmm.
A lion, a dragon, and a goat.
All right, very good. Yeah, dragon or serpent.
Okay,
and,
right.
And a goat. Yep.
Actually, I have a chimera miniature as well.
Oh, all right.
But it's not like in the room or anything, so that's not the one that I found.
Yeah, the goat's a little hard to remember because it's not like a fearsome monster or anything.
Right, it doesn't make sense. It's like, the lion, okay, that's a dragon, okay, yeah, that's scary. Goat, what's the goat doing there? Does it make milk? Chimera milk, I bet that's awesome. That's a rare delicacy.
Yeah, we'll have to start a microbrew or something called Chimera milk, or somebody should do that.
Yeah, or like sell Chimera cheese. It's like, oh, you haven't had a burger until you had it with some Chimera cheese on it.
There was actually a guy in a writing group I used to belong to in New York. Had been, like in the merchant marines or something, and sailed around the world and was in some country somewhere and went into this bar and, ordered some food or something. And they said, do you want something to drink with that? And he's like, sure. And they're like, okay, well, we have milk. And he's like, yeah, that's fine. And they just turn around and there's like this goat like standing there. And they just like milk the goat right in front of him and give him the goat milk.
Wow. That's a little gross. But before we get off the subject of chimeras, it should be pointed out that if you were like us or at least when you were like me, if you were like me as a kid, you thought it was pronounced Chimera, because that's how it's spelled. It's like Chimera. So it wasn't until much later that I learned, oh, it's Chimera.
Mm-hmm.
So in case you're not clear what the hell we're talking about, it's the Chimera thing.
Yeah. Okay, so if you're playing Dungeons and Dragons and there's an attractive woman who wants to have sex with you in the game, she's almost certainly one of these evil demons who will drain away your experience points.
Succubus?
Very good. And what would be a male equivalent?
Is that an incubus?
Yeah, very good. Yeah, wow. You really know your monsters here.
All right.
Two more. All right. Okay.
I've got a good one that I'm going to ask you about if you want to.
All right. So so these are like dragons, but instead of 4 limbs, they only have 2 limbs. And I think they have a stinging tail too. In Dungeons and Dragons, they do.
They only have 2 limbs.
Yeah, so like a dragon without, like imagine like a dragon, right, but without like arms, basically.
Wait, can you describe it more? Or say it again?
Yeah, so it's like imagine a dragon.
Yeah.
And then chop off its arms.
Right. Okay.
And that's it.
No, I don't remember that one.
Starts with a W.
Oh wait, a wyvern?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I didn't remember they only had 2 limbs. Was because are you not counting like wings or?
Right, they have wings.
Oh, okay, gotcha. Right, okay, gotcha. Yeah, I was just having trouble conceptualizing what this monster looked like. Okay, gotcha.
All right.
Yeah, so the wyvern. Okay.
Okay, and last of all, these are reptiles that will turn you to stone with their gaze.
Basilisk.
Very good. Very good.
Wow, I did really well.
Yeah, I'm impressed.
Okay, so here's the one I was going to ask you.
All right, bring it on. Is this your miniature?
No, this is not my miniature, but
okay.
It's something that I thought of when you were talking. So these monsters are like sort of they look like tiger men, but they have all these weird magical powers.
So is that a like
tiger men?
Like a Rakshasa or something like that?
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, Rakshasa. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, so those come out of like a real mythology though, apparently. Like I think it's out of like Indian mythology.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought that was cool. Like when I discovered them in like other fiction, it's like, oh, hey, I remember those from D&D.
Yeah.
But yeah, I always liked those. I always thought they were a cool monster. Well, I guess I can quiz you on this one, although it's pretty easy. So the miniature I have is it's a wizard who has become undead and stores his soul in a jar.
That is a lich.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So I have a lich here. You see, I know my monsters well enough that I did well on the pop quiz. Plus, I asked questions. I gave you a pop quiz in return.
Yeah. We are awesome.
Actually, there was another one I thought you might ask about, but I don't remember it well enough to really quiz you about it. But I'll just ask, like, you remember this one? It's called the Teresk.
Yeah. It's like a super hard to kill demon.
Yeah, I mean, like all I remember about it is like, I mean, they're like gigantic or something. They're like sort of like a giant elephant or whatever, right? In terms of size. But then it's just like
I think they're bigger than that.
Well, yeah, but I mean, yeah. So, but like that sort of scope. But you know, and like they just like leave a path of destruction in their wake. You know, as they travel across the land, and like they're basically immortal. And yeah. So I just always remember that they were like, I think it's like actually literally the hardest monster to kill in D&D.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, certainly in the first, you know,
right.
The second edition, you know, the first couple supplement kind of thing.
Yeah, they may have added more harder monsters since then, but it's hard to imagine that there would be anything harder to kill than that.
All right, there was just one other video game I wanted to mention that this is just a new game that came out, and it's called Horde. And it's like this dragon game where you play dragons, and it's like a multiplayer game. And so you have your different dragons, and the goal is just to be the dragon with the biggest horde at the end of the game. And so you fly around, you know, like burning villages and, you know, like kidnapping. There's like these like royal carriages, and you like swoop down on them and kidnap the princesses and then ransom them off and stuff. And I don't know, it just, you know, just looks like a really fun game to you know, again, to play sort of as a monster from the monster's point of view.
That sounds awesome. I don't know if you're planning to mention this later, but I was going to say we can't talk about sympathetic portrayals of monsters without mentioning Monsters, Inc.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I mean, you saw that, I assume, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean that was great. I mean that was Pixar, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean that was one of the earlier ones. But yeah, I mean I remember I really dug that one.
Well, it's just kind of like they take, like monsters who are hiding in your closet and scaring you, and kind of, you see them as just kind of like working stiffs, like 9 to 5, that's their job. And, it's just kind of funny to look at it that way. All right. But so moving into the realm of the classics for a bit, like speaking of like telling the story from the point of view of the monster, because I'd always heard of John Milton's epic poem, Paradise Lost. I'd always just heard that described as sort of like Lucifer's side of the story. And I've heard a lot of people sort of refer to it that way and talk about it that way. And so when I finally went and read it, and that's not actually what it is really, I mean, it's sort of the story, of Adam and Eve and the fall and the war in heaven and stuff, but it's not meant to be, Lucifer's side of the story. It's just that it kind of comes across that way because he's such a much more interesting character. This sort of led William Blake to famously say that Milton was of the devil's party without knowing it. But I mean, I think this is a really big challenge for a writer, is that so often the villains are just a lot more compelling than the heroes. And so like, Lucifer in the poem, I mean, he's very passionate and driven, and he really wants something, and characters, tend to be a lot more interesting when they want something. Whereas all the like quote unquote good characters are all just kind of boring. They're kind of, they're completely good, and they're completely confident of their own righteousness, and they're going to tell you about it for 10 pages at a time. And it's just really hard to be that engaged with a character like that. And, like when it's sort of the same thing with Dante, right? When you think of Dante, you think of hell, and Dante, he wrote about hell and purgatory and heaven. It's just that the hell is a lot more interesting, and that's sort of the only part anyone sort of remembers. And, like, I mean, dystopian fiction, is a lot more common than utopian fiction. There's almost no utopian fiction in the sense of actually showing a really actual nice place to live where everything's great. Because how do you even set a story there? What's the conflict? And, when Thomas More wrote Utopia, I mean, the word utopia literally means no place, this is something that couldn't really even exist. I guess you were saying, like, maybe we should talk about why are we drawn to stories, why are we sort of drawn to stories that are sympathetic to the monsters? I mean, that might be part of it there. It's just that we, that stories need conflict, and stories involving monsters have more conflict than stories involving people who have no problems,
Right. Yeah, and I mean, I think we all feel like sort of a monster at some point in our lives, right? I mean, especially us who grew up as geeks, we feel like, the sort of outcast or whatever, and depending on how rough your geekhood was as a child, you might be like, oh, well, what's wrong with me? Why do people make fun of me or whatever, and all that kind of stuff. And so, it's definitely easy for, I can imagine, plenty of geeks, having that, identifying with the monster, because it's like, oh, well, the monster is outcast like me.
Yeah, like, I mean, there's a writer, Sam Butler, and he, I don't know, for a while he had these T-shirts that said, like, "We are the Orcs," and like, speaking of Orcs again, and I think he had a website, like wearetheorcs.com or something. I don't know if it's still there, but just making that very explicit that when you're sort of an outsider, and you do sort of look at any story, where the good guys are fighting the bad guys, and sort of wonder, who would I be in this story, and am I getting the straight story about how bad these people are, or is it just sort of like people I know, do they just not understand? Is it just about misunderstanding or people being judgmental or things like that? I mean, like, sort of another classic thing I wanted to talk about was Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. I kind of, I mean, speaking of Jenny Boylan, I sort of associate this with her because, I went to Ireland, because she was, sort of the faculty person there. And so I took this whole class, like, on Frankenstein, basically. The guy was sort of a Mary Shelley scholar. And it's a really interesting, it's sort of beyond the scope of this podcast right now, but I mean, you should really look into Mary Shelley's life. I mean, she just had a fascinating life. Her father was a leading political philosopher and novelist, William Godwin, and her mother was a famous early feminist, Mary Wollstonecraft. And she married the like one of the most famous poets of the day, Percy Shelley. And there's just all sorts of like family drama and stuff like that. I mean, like, like her father, had been sort of a political radical and had advocated the abolition of marriage and free love and stuff like that. And then, then his daughter falls in love with this poet who unfortunately is already married to somebody else. And the dad's pissed off, and Percy's Shelley says, "Hey, I thought you were all about free love." And the dad's like, "Not with my daughter," And back in the day, I mean, like dating a romantic poet was like dating the drummer from Motley Crue or something. I mean, it was just like, he's like the bad boys of Europe, and but there's this really interesting story where they were vacationing, and it was like I'm trying to remember. I think there'd been like a big volcano eruption or something, and so the weather was really rainy that whole year. It was like the year without sunshine or something, and so they were all kind of trapped inside, and had been just sort of listening to German ghost stories and things like that, and just to keep themselves entertained, they thought maybe they would have a contest and like each try to come up with a ghost story, and I think she was like 19 or something at the time, and obviously sort of being married to this really famous poet, a lot of people in subsequent years said, "Oh, well, he must have actually been the genius behind Frankenstein, and she probably didn't do much," Mm-hmm. But then I read this analysis where actually the sort of the version of Frankenstein that most people have read was actually one that Percy Shelley kind of rewrote, and the scholar was sort of going through and comparing the two. And Frankenstein sort of has this reputation for being kind of like overwritten and purple and breathless and stuff. And so this scholar was arguing that actually a lot of that stuff is the changes that Percy made, and that if you go back to the original manuscript, it's actually much better. And so this guy who taught this class, he actually had us read the original 1818 manuscript, and it's great. It's just a really good story. So yeah, so I don't know, I really enjoyed that class. I really enjoyed that novel, and I definitely recommend people check it out. I mean, particularly if you sort of only have this idea of what the story of Frankenstein is, this kind of like from the movies, mm-hmm. The novel is completely different. There's no like castle and villagers with torches and stuff like that. It's a really much different thing. It was funny because I got the book, and there's a cover of this Arctic ice field on the cover. And I was like, what does this have to do with Frankenstein? Mm-hmm. And then you start reading your book, and you're like, oh wow, this is not what I was expecting at all.
Yeah. So, is it possible to get that original 1818 manuscript? Like, is there book versions of that you can buy?
Yeah. Yeah. I think if you go on Amazon, I think there are ones, where it's just like clearly marked. This mm-hmm. is the 1818 manuscript.
It's funny. I always wonder about like in that case, it sounds like maybe it was for the best, but. They unearthed the original manuscripts, but in a lot of these cases, you see an author's preferred edition, and it's like, oh, so what does that mean? That they, just now this is the version that they wrote and rejected all the editor's changes now, and so it's just it's like 20% longer, but not necessarily any better or more interesting.
Well, that's
I'm kind of curious though, because like there are some books that you can still get the original version, and it'd be curious to compare to see what the actual preferred edition incorporates that the other one didn't.
That's actually another kind of interesting thing with Frankenstein, actually, because everyone sort of remembers the theme of Frankenstein as being the sort of like there are some things man was not meant to know, mm-hmm. Kind of science meddling in nature where it shouldn't and stuff. And apparently, she released the novel initially, and I mean, it was just excoriated by critics. They just absolutely hated it. They thought it was just grotesque and sick and stuff. And so in response to that, she rewrote it to put in more of that kind of, oh, why did I trespass against God's plan kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. That really kind of ruins the book. And so, yeah, it's just like, the more you can just get back to the initial thing, that she wrote in its initial flash of brilliance, the better it is. So going from Frankenstein, this is a little less of a classic, but just when I think about monsters, I just, as I'm sort of drawing up my list, I can't help writing this down, is this movie I watched as a kid called My Demon Lover. Because the premise of this movie, it's sort of like The Incredible Hulk a little bit, but it's this guy, and when he was like 14 or something, he was fooling around with this girl, and her medium grandmother put a curse on him, and now every time he becomes sexually aroused, he turns into a monster.
Oh, right.
And so he has to.
I hate when that happens.
He just sort of has to. Well, it's got kind of interesting metaphorical resonances, right?
Yeah.
so he just sort of has to like live his life, without love and try to avoid, anything that's going to turn him on, because, then he'll start turning into this monster. I don't remember the movie particularly well. I couldn't tell you if it's good or not, but just something about that idea has always really stuck with me. And I don't know. Maybe if someone's watched that recently, post a comment and let us know what you thought, if it's worth rewatching.
I just wanted to point out that actually, if anybody's interested in reading Falcon Quinn and the Black Mirror, I actually reviewed that for Audible. So if you want to go check it out, you can see my review over there. It's just go to Audible and just search for Falcon Quinn and the Black Mirror, and you should be able to see it there. And I specifically reviewed the audiobook, obviously. So, but I passed judgment on the book as well as the audio narration. So, and I liked it. So, I would recommend people checking it out.
Okay, yeah, I just wanted to mention too that maybe people who tuned in for the Jennifer Finney Boylan interview are kind of interested in gender issues and stuff like that. And so I just wanted to make sure that everyone knows that there's this award in science fiction called the Tiptree Award, which deals with sort of gender issues in science fiction. And so if you're interested in that, you should definitely look up that award and look up some of the the books that have won that award. And there's a website for it called it's tiptree.org. Actually,
you also the Tiptree Foundation or whatever, that the group that puts out the award, they also put out an anthology. There's only been a couple. They've only been doing it the last couple of years, but I reviewed one of them once actually. So if you want to read that review, actually you can go to Intergalactic Medicine Show and check out the review for that. But I was like really, really impressed. Like, I like enjoyed the anthology, pretty much cover to cover. But like just all the different explorations of gender in science fiction, it was very interesting. You would think that could get, over the course of an anthology, you could see how that might. You might think that it would come off preachy or something, and so that the whole thing would add up to too much all at once. But I actually thought that it was very, very well done and very balanced, like just in terms of the types of stories presented.
And if people don't know too, the reason that the award is called the Tiptree Award is because there was this famous science fiction writer who published under James Tiptree Jr. and nobody knew who James Tiptree Jr. was, and it turned out that Tiptree was a woman named Alice Sheldon, who was a CIA agent, and so it was just sort of like second nature for her to create false identities and keep her her identity hidden and stuff like that. And but so it was just kind of interesting because there were all these stories written by a woman that people thought were written by a man, and just kind of the sort of the interesting discussions that come out of that. But there was this. I have not had a chance to read it, but there was this biography by Julie Phillips that came out a few years ago, and it's called James Tiptree Jr., The Double Life of Alice B. Sheldon. And everyone I've heard from has just said this is like the most amazing biography they've ever read, and she just had this amazing, amazing life. So
yeah, I actually highly recommend that. I did read that book, and I haven't read a lot of biographies, but I certainly enjoyed it a lot. I actually also reviewed that Intergalactic Medicine show, so you can go read my review of that over there too. But yeah, I'm not sure she was actually a CIA agent. She worked for the CIA, but she wasn't like a field agent.
Oh, you think she was like an analyst or something?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure she was like some kind of analyst. I haven't read the book in a while, but I'm pretty sure that she wasn't like an actual agent. But yeah. But I thought that was there were some really interesting anecdotes in that book, though. Like, there were various writers who, like, I think Robert Silverberg was one actually who had been asked something about Tiptree and he was talking about how masculine the writing was and everything.
Yeah. Well, I guess there was some speculation that Tiptree might be a woman, and they asked Silverberg about that, and he's like, "Oh, I don't think so. I think there's just something about Tiptree's writing that's just ineluctably masculine."
Yeah.
And I just read his memoir too, so I sort of got his take on that. But and he was kind of saying, he was saying, that he was as pleased as anyone to find out that that Tiptree was a woman, because it was just sort of surprising and interesting, and that there was certainly she was a very unusual person, and she knew a lot about guns and cars and things that made it difficult to determine who the author might be.
Yeah, and actually, I would suggest that if you don't know much about the life of Tiptree, but you're interested in what we've said so far, just go ahead and read the book and don't read the jacket copy or anything about it, because, there's kind of an ending that might get spoiled for you if you read too much about it. So, I would suggest going into it cold if you can, and then just seeing where it leads you. All right, well, that was our episode, and be sure to tune in next time when we're interviewing science fiction author Orson Scott Card. So thanks for listening.
The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is a production of IO9. For this episode's show notes, to subscribe to this podcast, or for more information about the show, visit geeksguideshow.com. To learn more about your hosts, visit johnjosephadams.com or davidbarkirtley.com. Music and voiceover produced by Slipgate 9 Entertainment. If you enjoyed this program, tell your friends. If you didn't enjoy it, tell no one. Thank you for listening.